Tēnā koutou katoa. Delighted to see you here today for us to talk about futures thinking, and we're extremely fortunate to have Stephanie Pride with us. Stephanie is a professional futurist and has been so for 20 years, but before that she worked extensively in the public service, operational, policy and central agency roles, so she's ideally placed to translate her excellent thinking about futures into the reality of the public service. For the last 11 years she's been running a New Zealand foresight consultancy. So thank you so much for coming. It's lovely to see you here. Perhaps we start by just saying, tell us a little bit about what your work involves.
Thank you, Shenagh. It's lovely to be here. So what I do is bring the whole body of academic research and tried and tested methods in the futures domain into practical work that's done by clients. So I take that whole body of knowledge and use it to help them think about the future in rigorous ways. So when you're trying to think 10, 20, 50 years out, there are lots of mistakes for new players, but as I say, there's already a body of knowledge and technique, so I bring that knowledge of how to do this well to fit with what they want to think about in their organisational sector.
Sounds great. So why was this going to be really useful for the public service, do you think?
Well, in one way or another, the public service is always having to think about the future. For example, in formal ways, in the 2013 State Sector Act, the amendment that put stewardship responsibility on the state sector, which meant that they actually had to think about how they would steward resources for the future. And more recently, the 2020 Public Service Act has affirmed that stewardship role and put a formal requirement on the public sector to be thinking for the long term.
Yes, and they'll be preparing long-term briefings, won't
yes,
they?
Yes,
so
the long-term insights briefings is going to be a core part of building that futures thought into the way the public service works on a daily basis.
Great. I know this is difficult, but can you just give me one little example of work you have done in the past with a public sector agency?
Certainly. A few years ago I worked with Inland Revenue. They were wanting to do an environmental scan as a starting point, so I worked with them to set their scanning approach up on a rigorous basis, and then when the scan was done, worked with them at various levels through the organisation to use a range of future tools and approaches to take that scan material and think about what different sorts of futures that could give rise to and what that would mean for them as an organisation and what it would mean for their work and the way they would advise government.
Right, that's great. There'll probably lots of other examples too, but I think we now need to move on to where would public servants begin? What is the most useful place to start to do this thinking?
Well, I think with almost anything when you start, actually basic vocabulary is a really useful place to start. I mean, for example, with rugby, if you don't know any rugby terminology, it's all just throwing a ball about. But if you know some of the terminology, you know what a throw-in is, and you know what a forward pass is, and you know the difference between the two and the difference they make to the game, actually you can talk and think about rugby in a much more nuanced and rigorous way. And the same with futures, that I think if you know some of the basic terms for different sorts of futures, it expands your capabilities to think about the future in richer ways.
Great. Well, I've seen this wonderful slide that you have shown me, and what we're going to do is put this slide up so that all the people watching can see it. And I think you're going to be able to talk through it and try and illustrate what each parts of the slide mean. So you'll be seeing this slide and you'll be hearing Stephanie's voice. You won't be hearing me for a while. Right.
Thank you, Shenagh. So this slide is based on one that was developed by Joseph Voros in the 90s. And what it helps us to see is that there isn't just one future, there are multiple futures. So in everyday conversation, we talk about the future in the singular, as though there was only one that we were heading towards. But every moment of every day, we're making myriads of decisions, and each one of those decisions, big and small, takes some futures out of contention and steers us towards other futures that are now more able to come into being. And it's really useful if we have a language around this, we can understand the concept better. So I think when Joseph Voros was developing his work in this area, he obviously liked alliteration because he defined 6 different types of future, and he started them all with a P word. So when you first look at these can seem initially a little bit confusing, but with the slide and the material that will be on the IPANZ website, hopefully the distinctions will become clear. I'm going to go once over lightly, but you'll be able to go to the website for more information. So, first of all, we have the potential future, and that is the widest category because everything beyond the present moment is a potential future. As Professor Riel Miller, who's head of foresight at UNESCO, says, the future doesn't exist because ahead of every moment there are multiple possible potential futures available. So that's the widest category. At the other end of the scale, in the middle of this diagram, we can see we've got the concept of the projected future. So that's the singular, default, business as usual, baseline future. It's the extrapolated continuation of the past through the present into the future, a single line, a single place. And that's the one we often see in planning documents. And that one is practically useful on a day-to-day basis, but it builds in underlying assumptions that everything is going to continue to happen in the same way and at the same rate. So projected future, we're all probably familiar with that, even though we don't know that term for it. The next term that Voros developed was the probable future, and by this he meant those things we think are likely to happen based on current trends. This category already isn't singular. The projected future, there's just one of them. Probable futures, there are already more than one. But quite often when we think about probable futures, we actually only think about a small range of quantitative data, and we don't bring in qualitative thinking around that. Probable futures are wider than the projected future, but it's a really important thing to remember that just because a future is probable, it doesn't mean that's the future we'll probably get. The next category is plausible futures, and Voros defined this group as things we think could happen based on our current understanding of how the world works, and that we can construct a coherent narrative from what we know now to what this plausible future could be. And he made a distinction between that thing, a plausible future, and possible futures, and the distinction he made was the plausible future is based on knowledge we already have. The possible futures, they're a wider category, so they are based on knowledge that we may have at some time in the future. So again, stepping out in this range of possibilities. So, for example, back in 1993, when the structure of DNA was discovered, today's situation in relation to 24-hour-less genome sequencing would have been a possible future, but not necessarily a plausible future, because the knowledge we needed to do genome sequencing hadn't been discovered. So that was in the realm of possibility, but it wasn't plausible because the knowledge existing to create the coherent narrative of that future didn't exist yet. So plausible, it's different from our common way of using plausible, and then possible, one step out. And then the last step out in his 6 Ps is Preposterous Futures, and actually it's a really useful concept living today. So these are things that are just be ridiculous, impossible, they'll never happen. And this category, in developing this category, he's drawing on the work of Professor James Data from the University of Hawaii. And he has a set of laws about the future, and his second law of the future says, any useful idea about the future should appear ridiculous. as we can see, we might, in 2020, we may well feel that we are living in a preposterous future. And if someone had said to you 15 years ago that the star of The Apprentice was going to be running the United States and that Britain was about to leave the EU and that the Australian bushfires would not be the greatest calamity of the year, you may well have seen that as a preposterous future. And it just shows why it's useful to have the terminology so we can push ourselves to think across that whole range of futures, because what would have seemed a preposterous future 10 to 15 years ago is actually the future that the present that we've got. So that's that sort of piece, and we're going to move on to another set now. And what you might have noticed that up until now we've had nothing normative in those definitions. They are just describing a typology in a neutral way. Now we come to the preferable future, and preferable futures are those we think or feel should or ought to happen. So it brings in those normative assumptions and value judgments. And we all have preferred futures, whether we articulate them or not. And it's often we don't, until we sit down and think about it explicitly, we don't really understand fully what our preferred futures are. But it's really important for us to understand this if we're going to be effective thinkers about the future for the public service. Because at one level, if we understand what our preferred futures are, it gives us greater agency in acting to bring them into being. But also, often our preferred futures affect our perception of what are probable or plausible futures. So it's almost like looking through rose-tinted glasses around that one. And then there is the concept of the assumed future. Mm-hmm. And this is one I've developed from working with clients because it's actually been really useful to them. So the assumed future is the future most people are expecting to move towards, whether they articulate it or not. So it's not the same as the projected future. There may be some overlaps, but it's not. Often our assumptions about the future are largely unconscious, or even if they are conscious, they're tacit, they're not actually made explicit and clear. And to the extent that our assumed future may be based on either not up-to-date understandings in some areas, or maybe not a wide enough understanding of what has been happening and what's happening now, it can actually limit our understanding of the possible and the probable futures. So spending some time understanding either individually or as an organisation what our assumed future is a really useful exercise to go through to put more rigour into your futures thinking. And then I'll just touch really briefly on this last category, because I think this is also useful for enriching our thinking, is ambient futures. And this is a concept that's being developed at the moment by Dr. Wendy Schultz from the University of Houston-Clear Lake. And she's developed this term to help us understand that there's no such thing as a normal future from which all other futures are exceptions, and no images of the future that are more plausible than other images. So if we go back to that understanding at the beginning about the range of futures that sits there, and her point is that we actually can move in any direction from the point we're at today. And again, even a few years ago, it was harder to get this concept. In 2020, we would maybe sort of complain we're not in the normal future we expected, but there is no normal future. It's ambient. We can actually move in any direction from the future that we have today. So that was a very quick once over lightly, and there's more information on the IPANZ website if you want to delve into this a little bit more.
That was really fascinating, thank you. And I think your point that to be talking about this in 2020 at this time makes absolutely clear the importance of the quality of this thinking. So thank you very much. Let's finish with 2 or 3 very quick pieces of advice to public servants attempting this work.
Okay, so some of the things I think are really useful to do is, one, make sure you have enough time to do this work. With other pieces of work, if you're developing an IT system, you would think about what is a reasonable time frame in which to do this. Doing good thinking work requires rigour.
Yep.
So it's making the time to build in the rigour, and also it's iterative, so making the time to iterate and deepen your thinking as you go is really, really important. Another thing is to bring in diverse voices.
Yep.
That it's really important to make sure you're not acting in a monoculture. The future is the product of multiple actions across multiple domains, and if you're not having those voices in the room, it will limit the futures that you can see. And then linked to that point, I think that you need to start from a really, really rich understanding of what has been happening and what is happening now. A rich, deep, multi-dimensional understanding, because the possible or preposterous or preferred futures that you can imagine are, in building those, you draw on your understanding of the past and the present. So the richer your understanding of those things, the richer your futures thinking will be.
Thank you very much indeed. I find this work fascinating, and the breadth of your knowledge is wonderful. And thank you for explaining it so well. Such a complex area, so simply. And I hope you've enjoyed it too, and I hope you will dig in. As Stephanie said, we do have this slide and the descriptions on the website. That's just a beginning for you. Thank you very much for spending time listening to this.